Now, without further ado, I will step into a role as moderator and introduce our first speaker, Professor Robert Glass. Professor Glass's cursus honorum includes a PhD at Princeton, an MA in the history of art at Williams College, as well as an MA in anthropology from Stanford, where he also took his BA. Professor Glass has been the recipient of many prestigious fellowships, among these a 3-year fellowship from the Center for the Advanced Study of Visual Arts, the National Gallery of Art in Washington. And more recently, he has resided in South Bend, Indiana at Notre Dame, where he is a visiting assistant professor. In addition to teaching, Professor Glass has published a series of substantial articles on 15th century sculpture. Of these, I will single out just one, an essay on Filarete's doors at the Church of St. Peter's in Rome, which appeared in 2012 in the Art Bulletin, so our discipline's journal of record. The essay is, if I may say, a model of art historical scholarship, characterized not only by its astonishing conversancy with the period literature, its archival rigor, or its concern to define and reevaluate the historical texture of the topic, but its visceral attachment to the iridescent doors themselves, their materiality and their technical skill. And I suspect this is something that we will see or witness powerfully in his much-awaited book on Filarete. My co-organizers and I are honored that he has joined us today, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Glass, whose paper today is called From Medieval Drollery to Classic Exemplum, Marginal Decoration on Church Portals in Florence and Rome around 1400.
Thank you, Dan, for that gracious introduction. And thank you to Amy and Timothy and Richard for inviting me and for organizing this symposium. I need the, thank you, Dan. Oh, you want to do it for me? Sure. Just like in the old days. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay. The works of greatest interest to me in the exhibition are these. On the left, the dead Christ as the Man of Sorrows, and on the right, a nude standing figure with a club, the classical hero Hercules. These come from the most famous of the 4 side portals of the Duomo in Florence, the Porta della Mandorla, carried out in 3 phases from 1391 to 1422. Both works were part of the archivolts surrounding the lunette above the doorway. Due to their poor condition, they were removed along with several adjacent pieces during the restoration of the portal in 1870 and replaced with copies. They're displayed today in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, as in the current exhibition, in the company of other works of figural sculpture from the cathedral, encourages comparisons of figural form and style. Indeed, these and other figures on the Porta della Mandorla have often been discussed as nascent examples of the stylistic revolution that has long been a central narrative of Renaissance art. And I have to revise this statement now that I've seen how the museum is going to be reconfigured to put everything back in its context. Although these, I guess, won't be in their original context. But that's what I'm going to talk about today. If instead of focusing on the figures and style, however, we contemplate the fragmentary nature of these objects, they can instead prompt us to think about the larger decorative program of which they were a part. The design of the archivolts follows the pattern established by the door jambs and splays below the lunette, which were made first. Alternating with twisted colonnettes, 2 relief bands frame the doorway and the lunette. Their decoration is inspired by an ancient Roman relief type known as a peopled scroll. On the inner band, acanthus vines sprouting at the bottom run up each jamb across the lintel, culminating in the center on either side of a depiction of Christ holding a book and blessing in a hexagonal frame. As the vines ascend, they trace an oscillating S shape, sprouting tendrils that curl back, forming a series of circles. In the middle of each circle, the tendril culminates with a figure. The outer bands are a variation of the same type. Acanthus populated with figures grows up the reliefs, but diamond-shaped frames containing angels divide the vines into discrete segments containing one figure each. Here the tendrils grow symmetrically, framing each figure rather than oscillating back and forth. Above, in the lunette, the two bands of relief in the archivolts follow the same pattern, but in this case, the acanthus scrolls on the inner relief are mostly devoid of figures, and the outer reliefs culminate at the top of the arch with the Man of Sorrows, paralleling the figure of Christ in the center of the lintel below. The Porta della Mandorla sculptors emulated the ancient peopled scroll, not only in its basic structure, but also in its iconography, populating the acanthus vines with pagan figures. The most prominent of these is Hercules. In addition to his appearance on the archivolt fragment in the exhibition, he appears 5 times on the lower reliefs. On the left splay, he stands holding his club, now missing in his right hand, and with his other attribute, the lion skin draped over his left arm. This figure, more finely modeled than the archivolt depiction and the most classicizing of the 6 Hercules representations on the portal, is the most celebrated of the group. The other 4 occur on the adjacent jam relief, slightly higher up. First, Hercules is shown in a half-length representation holding his club, again missing, and then in 3 tendril scrolls directly above, battling the Hydra, Antaeus, and the lion. Of the many other figures among the acanthus, some are generic prototypes, but a number have distinctive attributes. An abundance figure appears on the right splay opposite Hercules, and scholars have argued that Apollo, Saturn, Venus, Diana, and Mars are also depicted. Comprehensive study of the relief's iconography. Did I get out of sync there? Okay, no, we're okay. Comprehensive study of the relief's iconography has yet to be undertaken, and the significance of many of the figures remains uncertain. However, it seems that all the figures within the acanthus, whether meant to be identified specifically or not, were intended to be understood as pagan. This is made apparent by the one quality that unites them all, their nudity. As Nicholas Himmelmann argued, the equating of nudity with paganism was a medieval conceit that is in practice here, even if that nudity in some cases expresses a heroic classicism that seemed to indicate a new attitude toward antiquity. So the obvious question is, what is the function of these pagan figures? Why do they appear here around the portal of a church dedicated to Mary and juxtaposed more immediately with images of Christ and scroll-bearing angels? Erwin Panofsky picked out 4 of the figures and argued that they functioned as allegories of the cardinal virtues. Later scholars have found this interpretation implausible since it does not explain the purpose of the many other figures in the acanthus. A more popular reading, first proposed by Richard Krautheimer, instead focuses on the significance of Hercules as a symbol of Republican Florence. A century earlier, Hercules was added to the Florentine city seal, and the decade before work began on the Porta della Mandorla, the Florentine chancellor, Coluccio Salutati, wrote a treatise extolling the virtues of Hercules as a tyrant slayer. The Hercules representation on the Porta della Mandorla, or the Hercules representations on the Porta della Mandorla, have thus been understood as exempla proclaiming Republican values. Again, however, such analysis does not account for the other figures or the logic behind the acanthus decoration as a whole. In light of this, it seems sensible to begin by considering the whole rather than the individual details. The peopled scroll was an ancient relief type. Making sense of its use on the Porta della Mandorla requires understanding the significance of this type, both historically, where and how else has it been used, and artistically, what kinds of challenges and opportunities does the making of this type of ornament present? First, the historical question. The use of the peopled scroll on the Porta della Mandorla is not an isolated case. 2 other examples are closely related. In the late 1370s, a decade or so before work began on the Porta della Mandorla in 1391, ornamentation of the portal on the other side of the Florentine Duomo, the Porta dei Canonici, was undertaken. As on the Porta della Mandorla, the doors, jambs, and lintels were decorated with acanthus vines populated with numerous figures. Here, too, the figures seem intended to illustrate the pagan world, though through a wider variety of imagery. Nudity is an attribute, but not universal in this case. An abundance personification is clothed, along with all the other female figures. We also find a variety of non-Christian archetypes. For example, a wild man armed with a shield and club in battle with a centaur archer, semi-nude men draped with togas, and a dragon with a human head recalling images of the Antichrist. The Porta dei Canonici reliefs have received very little attention from scholars. The few who have commented on the iconography have concluded that there is no program. Later, about a decade after the Porta della Mandorla was completed, the ancient people scroll type was used again, this time by Filarete in the borders of each of the bronze doors he made for the central portal of St. Peter's in the Vatican. Filarete, born and trained in Florence, must have observed with great interest the completion of the Porta della Mandorla during his youth and been very familiar with the Porta dei Canonici as well. Filarete's acanthus reliefs, the most complex of the three, are also peopled with pagan subjects. Portrait heads of emperors, empresses, and ancient Roman heroes are surrounded with small narrative vignettes drawn from a variety of ancient sources. The labors of Hercules, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Virgil's Eclogues, Aesop's Fables, the ancient Roman history, and many others. Systematic study of Filarete's border reliefs is yet to be undertaken. As with the Porta della Mandorla, interpretations of selected elements have been attempted, including one that reads a number of the figures as Christian allegories, but no convincing interpretation of the whole has been proposed. Again, there does not seem to be a specific iconographic program. Over a period of 50 years or so, then, we have three related cases in which the ancient peopled scroll type was used on a church portal. What is the origin and function of this type? There are several late medieval monuments that might have played some role as a precedent, but these point to the same ancient source, and in the interest of time, I will move directly to this. Various peopled scroll fragments have survived from antiquity, but the examples best known in late medieval Italy are the 5 reliefs now in the grottos of St. Peter's in Rome, of which you see 3 here. Thought to have been made in the Severan period around 200 AD, the reliefs are of 2 types. 4 of them, illustrated by the 2 narrower reliefs here, are similar. The acanthus vines grow upward in an oscillating S-shape, sprouting curling circular tendrils, and densely populated with putti animals and birds. The same structure and some of the same figural motifs are used on the jambs and lintels of both portals in Florence and on the borders of Filarete's doors. The 5th ancient relief, wider and more elaborate than the others, is somewhat different. Here, the acanthus does not trace S-curves, but grows upwards symmetrically, and the primary figures are identifiable and more monumental. From bottom to top, left to right here on the screen, we see Apollo standing next to a tripod, Tellus surrounded by personifications of the 4 seasons, and Apollo and Marsyas framed by the muses, or by 4 muses. Displays of the Porta della Mandorla adopt the acanthus structure and more monumental figures of this relief, and a few motifs occur on the Porta dei Canonici as well. Based on such correspondences, in the literature on all 3 portals, scholars have noted the Vatican reliefs as a source of formal inspiration. I think the connection, however, goes deeper than this. First and foremost, the emulation was typological. The adoption of formal qualities was undertaken because the later reliefs were intended to function in the same way as the ancient ones. So what was the function of the Severan reliefs at the time? In the medieval and Renaissance periods, they decorated the oratory Pope John VII built in Old St. Peter's in the early 8th century. Located against the counter facade in the northeast corner of the basilica, the oratory was torn down with the rest of the building in the early 17th century, but its basic appearance is preserved in drawings made at the time. The oratory, dedicated to the Virgin Mary, consisted of an altar framed by a small barrel vault supported by twisted columns, similar to those used to frame the altar over St. Peter's tomb at the other end of the basilica. Called Solomonic columns because they were believed to come from the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, these are ancient spolia. The 5 ancient peopled scroll reliefs embedded vertically in the walls are also spolia. The 6th relief visible in the drawing, also still preserved in the grottos, is a medieval imitation from the time of John VII, probably. The space was also decorated with mosaics, including scenes from the life of Christ on the wall above the altar vault and from the life of St. Peter on the side wall left of the altar. Around 1300, the status of the oratory was increased when an elevated shrine was added, shown in plan on Grimaldi's drawing here. To hold Veronica's veil, the cloth believed to have been miraculously imprinted with Christ's face. This became one of the most venerated relics in Rome, and as a result, in the 14th and 15th centuries, John's oratory was one of the most important sites in Old St. Peter's. The basic function of the ancient peopled scroll reliefs in this context can be surmised from the inscription on John VII's tomb, which was set in the floor before the altar. It read in part, quote, "Previous squalor removed, John brought together splendor from all parts, so that posterity might be amazed by the lavishness. Not sparing riches, he distributed whatever he had that was precious," end quote. This suggests that the ancient reliefs were admired for their artistry. They were included because of the splendor inherent in their elaborate carving. But the iconography of the reliefs surely did not go unnoticed. The copious pagan figures make clear that the works are spolia, and as such, they may have been understood as literal spoils, trophies testifying to the triumph of Christianity and the superseding of the pagan era with the era of Christ. The pagan splendor of the reliefs offers visual proof of the magnitude of that triumph. We should consider the possibility that the peopled scrolls on the portals we are considering here were conceived with the same double function in mind. Most fundamentally and obviously, they convey splendor. The copiousness and variety inherent in the peopled scroll type make it a particularly effective means of doing this. But the use of pagan iconography and the formal connections with the ancient reliefs in John's oratory suggest that they also emulate, typologically, the Vatican reliefs' function as spolia. They testify to the glory of the Christian triumph by portraying an impressive pagan world. This works, of course, because the peopled scrolls are marginal elements. Both in John's oratory and on the portals, the primary essential narratives affirming Christian sovereignty are represented in the central larger spaces. As the rich scholarship on medieval marginal decoration has demonstrated, margins are places in which alternative, inverted, or even subversive narratives might be enacted. Here, this takes the form of vibrant representations of the pagan world that preceded the Christian one. If we take this as the basic program of the portal reliefs, they no longer seem iconographically incoherent. Charged with creating, on the model of the Vatican spolia, splendid peopled scrolls teeming with impressive pagans, the sculptors responded in different ways, even in the case of the Porta della Mandorla, within the same monument. The nature of the peopled scroll type must have encouraged variety and experimentation. And here we reach the second consideration I mentioned earlier, the artistic question. What challenges and opportunities did creating such a work entail? Iconographically, the biggest challenge must have been the number of different figures required. Copiousness and variety were a key part of the brief. But the marginal status of the work likely afforded the artist a certain degree of freedom in designing those figures, and may have even encouraged them to be unconventional. Using the Vatican reliefs as a starting point, the idea of pagan could be elaborated in a variety of ways, and the sculptors of the portals, some more than others, were particularly imaginative in doing so. This is the context, I believe, from which further analysis of the reliefs must begin. There are a number of aspects worth exploring, but in the brief time remaining, I would like to make just a few general observations about the way the idea of paganism is portrayed in each case. Here I finally get to the first part of my title, From Medieval Drollery to Classical Exemplum. These terms and categories are reductive, necessitated by the concision required of titles, but the sort of evolution they suggest is easy to see in the works. The paganism of the Porta dei Canonici peopled scroll is the most diverse. Copious pseudotypes, animals, and birds inspired by the Vatican reliefs make up the majority of the figures, but the artists have also added their own inventions: centaurs, wild men, the hybrid satanic beast, and exotic animals, such as a monkey and a camel. Paganism is conceived here as other, an absence of Christian civilization. The original elements recall the types of figures found in Gothic manuscript margins, and there is a medieval sense of mockery. The semi-nude males seen here, for example, on the bottom right, seem in their gesticulating poses to be playful caricatures of the Apollo-type figures on the most elaborate of the Vatican reliefs. The tone of the Porta della Mandorla, at least in its most innovative sections, could not be more different. Here, antiquity takes on a heroic tone and becomes exemplary. Hercules, a virtuous pagan, is included multiple times. His pose in the most classicizing depictions, adapted from the Apollo figures on the Vatican reliefs, celebrates antiquity rather than mocking it. The exemplarity expressed here, however, is not only positive. Negative cases are also included. For example, in the archivolt above the figure of Hercules in the exhibition, a Pudo is shown stabbing a snail. Snail combat, as Lillian Randall has shown, appears frequently in Gothic manuscript margins, functioning as an exemplum of cowardice. Here, the medieval drollery contrasts with the bravery exemplified by the classical Hercules below it. Filarete's peopled scrolls are the most elaborate of the three. His doors, mounted in the central portal of Old St. Peter's, were of course only a few meters away from the oratory of John VII. But Filarete's thinking about the peopled scroll type was filtered through his knowledge of the examples on the Florentine Duomo. Only his birds and animals can be traced to the oratory reliefs directly. For most of his material, Filarete instead seems to have drawn on the burgeoning humanist culture of the time. For the Roman portrait heads, he studied ancient coins, and for the narrative scenes, he looked to ancient texts. As on the Porta della Mandorla, he included some of Hercules' labors. See, go up here. And his images also seem to present the pagan past as a world of both positive and negative exempla. But despite his impressive display of humanist knowledge, Filarete did not ignore completely the medieval tradition. In perhaps what is a tribute to the two portals on the Duomo in Florence, he included both the snail combat exemplum and the hybrid satanic beast. Much more can be said about the peopled scroll in these portals, but these examples show that taking a typological approach to the whole rather than focusing on the details is essential when dealing with such copious and varied iconography, Indeed, by taking a comparative approach in this way, the three portals proved to be a fascinating index of evolving attitudes toward antiquity at the time. Thank you.
Our second speaker, Andrew Butterfield, is the president of Andrew Butterfield Fine Arts, LLC. In this capacity, he concentrates on the discovery, authentication, and sale of museum-quality masterpieces of European art, chiefly Renaissance and Baroque sculpture. A preeminent scholar-dealer, he combines 30 years of experience at the highest level in every sector of the art world, academia, museums, and the art market. Dr. Butterfield has found and sold dozens of major works of art, including important discoveries of paintings and sculptures by Bernini, Donatello, Ghiberti, Giambologna, Mantegna, and Riccio. His clients include many of the top private collectors and museums in the world, such as the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Kimball. Somehow, amidst all of this work, Dr. Butterfield has found time to publish, both frequently and extensively, although today I have no intention of choosing from among his many articles and books. There are over 100. What is to be pointed out, or what is to be pointed to rather, is the extraordinary intellectual as well as geographical range of his work. He has addressed, among many other artists, Fra Angelico, Verrocchio, Titian, Canova, and Picasso, not to mention his steady flow of reviews for the New York Review of Books, of which he is a mainstay. His research has won many prestigious awards, among them the Bernard Berenson Prize and the Mitchell Prize for Best Book in the Visual Arts. Today, Dr. Butterfield will speak to us on sculptors' models in Renaissance Florence.
Thank you, Dan, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Richard and everyone else at the museum for inviting me to speak today. My talk will be about sculptors' models in Florence. And in the middle of the 14th century, when Andrea Pisano wanted to depict a personification of sculpture, he showed a sculptor carving a statue, presumably of marble, with a hammer and chisel. 200 years later, when Battista Lorenzi wanted to make a personification of sculpture for the tomb of Michelangelo, he instead made a figure holding a incomplete model. And my talk today will be about how that change came about. And I believe that what we will see is that primarily, Ghiberti and Donatello reimagined and reinvented the model, the sculptor model, in the beginning of the 15th century. Since antiquity, since the recovery of monumental sculpture in the, when they started making monumental sculpture again in the 11th century, sculptors had primarily relied on drawings rather than three-dimensional models. But Donatello and Ghiberti started using three-dimensional models instead. And the primary advantage of this was that it freed the sculptor from a constraining reference to the sculpture, to the block as quarried that came to them from when they began making their sculpture. This enabled them to imagine the figure to move and to stand with far greater freedom and expressiveness. The reimagining that they, of the model that they conceived became fundamental for making sculpture in Europe for the next 600 years until the early 20th century, when sculptors began instead preferring again to carve directly on their sculptures, on their blocks, rather than to work from a model. And another point is that this story of the recovery of the model is a Florentine story. Every phase in the reimagining and the reconception, the making, and the collecting of models begins in Florence. and radiates from Florence to the rest of Italy. So that, in brief, is an overview of what my talk will be about. Now, as I mentioned, when sculptors first began making monumental sculpture, again, as you can see in these examples, there is a pronounced blockiness to the figure. You can easily see the, or imagine the block from which the figure was carved. The works are very stiff and rigid, and planar and rectilinear, and the carving is rather shallow. 200 years later, when Andrea Pisano made a figure for the Campanile, there are many advances on what had happened previously, but you can still feel the presence of the block. It is still planar, and the drapery is still the drapery is still oriented towards the front. 6 years later, when Donatello makes the Jeremiah, there's been a tremendous transformation. The drapery now has this volume and softness and suppleness, and the forms turn the corners of the block, so that the block has now begun to be stepped away from as a constant reference for the artist in the conception and making of the sculpture. So there was a greater change in the making of sculpture between Donatello and Andrea Pisano in 60 years than between Andrea Pisano and the sculptor who made the Ezekiel 200 years before. Now, before we look at models of Ghiberti and Donatello, we have to look at other sculptors in the Trecento to see whether it is really true that they used, that they relied primarily on drawings, or whether there are exceptions to this rule. One possible exception is the workshop of Nicola and Giovanni Pisano. After all, they did at times work from wax models. This is a bronze statue cast by them for the fountain in Perugia, which was very clearly made from a wax model. Moreover, Giovanni Pisano conceived works which needed to be seen in the round and to accommodate a wide spectrum of viewpoints, and therefore, conceivably, he would not have planned these only in drawing. Furthermore, even in cases when he was not required to do so, such as this figure of Miriam, which was high up on the facade of the cathedral in Siena, he took the opportunity to conceive the forms of the statue in a wide spectrum of viewpoints. So it is conceivable, though by no means certain, that Giovanni Pisano and Nicola Pisano may have sometimes used three-dimensional models. But even if they did, their followers did not. These are examples by two of the most important sculptors to emerge from Giovanni Pisano's workshop and Nicola Pisano's workshop, and Arnolfo di Cambio and Tino di Camaino, both of whom, by the way, were capamaestro at the cathedral in the 14th century. The other possible exception is Andrea Pisano. After all, we know for a fact that the bronze doors for the baptistry were made from wax models. Wax models are mentioned in the documentation for the door, and of course that is the primary way that you make a bronze statue. And then we have this utterly astonishing sculpture in Pisa at Centomia della Spina, which is so beautiful and carved with such sophistication and in a manner that seems planned fully in the round, that it's easier to imagine this being worked up originally as a three-dimensional model rather than as a drawing or as a series of drawings. However, we have other cases in the work of Andrea Pisano where the evidence suggests that the works were made from drawings. These are reliefs from the Campanile, and they look like drawings, that have in very low relief, that have been transformed into low reliefs. And moreover, in his commentary, Ghiberti tells us that he has seen drawings for the Campanile reliefs by Giotto, who, as you know, was the original architect and sculptor of the Campanile. So we know that at least some of these reliefs were actually made from drawings. And as we had already discussed a moment ago, the statues for the Campanile also seem to have been, have a simplicity of form that it allows us to imagine they were made primarily from drawings rather than from a three-dimensional model. It's also noteworthy that the statues for the facade of the cathedral are documented to have been made, or at least in the cases where we have documents mentioning mentioning designs, the designs are by painters. So presumably painters supplied drawings rather than three-dimensional models. Now, the oldest model that perhaps exists from the Gothic, from Italy in the Gothic and Renaissance period is this terracotta statuette at the cloister, at the cloisters. The date of the piece is not known with complete certainty. The Metropolitan attributes the work to Goro di Gregorio, a sculptor in the middle of the 14th century. Other people believe that it was made later in the 14th century. But what's really crucial here is to recognize that it is also thought by conservators and curators at the Metropolitan that it is likely a model made by a goldsmith for goldsmith work. Goldsmiths, unlike stone carvers, absolutely needed to make models in order to make their goldsmith work. With that in mind, we should recall that Ghiberti was one of the great goldsmiths of his day, and therefore would have had extensive experience in making models. Moreover, Ghiberti made this statement in the commentary: "Modeling in clay is the mother of the art of sculpture. Praxiteles never started any important work without first making a trial version of it in clay." Now, I'm sure that many of you will recognize that Ghiberti's statement is in fact a quotation from Pliny, from the Natural Histories. But that is striking too, because it meant that for Ghiberti, there was classical sanction for the making of models. It's also interesting to note that Petrarch, in his copy of the Natural Histories, marked this line. In fact, Pliny goes on, and Ghiberti goes on, quoting him to say that terracotta sculpture was preeminent in Etruria, which they thought of correctly as the ancient region of Tuscany. More evidence of Ghiberti's use of models appears in the competition panel, made when he was only something like 21 years old. If we look at Brunelleschi's panel, we see that it is relatively flat and oriented almost exclusively to the viewer, imaginary viewer standing directly in front of the piece. But Ghiberti's sculpture, on the other hand, is conceived in a way that can be seen happily from a wide variety of viewpoints. And the figures of it have a suppleness and and move in space with a kind of freedom that is unprecedented in Italian sculpture. If we look at the figure of Isaac from about 180 degrees, we see that there's an unbroken continuity of modeling. The forms are not an integration of three different viewpoints. They're in fact a continuous viewpoint. And there's only one way to achieve that, which is to make a model in front of a living person or a statue, and to work it as you walk around the model. We also have two works which, in some way, record models by Ghiberti or from his workshop. This extraordinary piece is one of those things that has fallen out of the literature. It is a stucco cast, according to Boda, who published it in 1904. It is a stucco cast of a wax model by Lorenzo Ghiberti. It still survives. It's in the deposit at the Boda's Museum in Berlin. It has not been photographed in about 100 years, and it has not been published since 1949. It seems to me that the attribution to Ghiberti is is dead on. We also have this terracotta fragment or study piece at the Art Museum in Princeton. Now, this is one of those things where, because we haven't been sure what it is, we've just decided not to talk about it. But we can exclude a number of possibilities. It's not a fake. The thermoluminescence test shows that it is not a modern piece. And it is not a copy after the corresponding scene on the corresponding figures on the panel of Ghiberti. It seems not to be by Ghiberti, since the quality of the modeling and the detailing is not as high as that in things that we know to be truly by him. So it would look like it is probably a piece made by someone in the studio, whether the primary maker of that scene or a copy by someone in the studio of the primary model for that portion of a preparatory model for that portion of the relief. It's important to recall that for 50 years, Ghiberti's workshop was a training ground for the painters and sculptors of Florence. Ghiberti was one of those supremely gifted artists who was unafraid to employ the most talented young people he could find, and to show them what he was doing. And as a result, as I said, for 50 years, a series of the most brilliant painters and sculptors in Florence passed through his workshop and saw him making models and made models under his direction. It's also important to recall that Ghiberti helped revive the medium of terracotta as a medium for sculpture. This absolutely fabulous piece was discovered by accident about 15 years ago in the Palazzo Vescovile in Fiesole. And I should note that there are many scholars in Florence who believe that it is by Brunelleschi, but I think the majority of opinion is that it's by Ghiberti. One of the sculptors who worked, at least for a time, in Ghiberti's workshop was Donatello. This piece, is sometimes said to be by Ghiberti, it's sometimes said to be by a member of the workshop of Ghiberti, and it's sometimes said to be by Donatello. I personally believe that the attribution to Donatello is absolutely certain, whether or not he was working in the shop. Now, it's worth recalling that the earliest documented model that we know of was made by Donatello and Brunelleschi for the Duomo in, I think, 1412. And he also made the Joshua in the monumental Joshua in terracotta that Dan showed a print of. I should mention that we also have one terracotta relief, which is very plausibly attributed to Donatello, a model, though one that would have been made in the 1440s when he worked in Padua. If we compare terracotta statues by Donatello with marble statues by Donatello, you can see why or how fundamental making terracotta models was for his reconception of how to make a marble. If you compare the drapery forms and the Spiritello at the top of the Cavalcanti Annunciation with the drapery forms of one of the Spiritelli on the Cantoria, you can see how he has decided to make marble statuary with to give it a kind of suppleness that was previously impossible to imagine or to achieve in the carving of stone. Once you've seen that kind of effect as a transference of the experience of modeling in clay and wax to marble, you begin to see it everywhere in his works from the middle of the second decade on. So even in a work such as celebrated as the relief from the St. George and the Dragon, if you look at the drapery, it has this kind of fluidity that was unlike anything made before. And the Jeremiah has as I think I mentioned, the way it turns the corner is something that you would have a very hard time doing simply on the basis of drawings. And just to reiterate how different it was from what was being done 2 generations before. When I was at the opening of the exhibition a couple of nights ago, I noticed something about the Abraham and Isaac, which is that in Alberti's text on sculpture, he mentions that there are 2 advantages of working from models. One is that the sculptor can move the limbs of the body with greater freedom. And the other is that you can make more concavities in the statue. And there they are in the Abraham and Isaac. You see both of those features very prominently incorporated into the conception of the sculpture. There's another point to be made about Donatello and about Ghiberti. As I mentioned a short while ago, in the 1380s and 90s, we have instances of painters making designs for sculptors. Ghiberti and Donatello, instead, are sculptors who make designs for painters. This, as you all know, is a panel from the Pisa altarpiece by Masaccio, and John Popenisi, many years ago, argued, I believe persuasively, that Donatello, who was in Pisa at that time, made models for Masaccio. Now, there is a second phase in the production of terracotta models and clay models in Florence, and that phase begins with the artists who were actually born about the time of the Pisa altarpiece or the completion of the Zuccone. Prominent among these is Andrea del Verrocchio. About 15 years ago, Giancarlo Gentilini, I believe it was, discovered this extraordinary head in the Chigi Saraceni collection in Siena, which he I believe, correctly identified as a work by Verrocchio. And terracotta models and clay models of heads and hands and limbs are mentioned in Vasari's Life of Verrocchio. One of the things that's striking about this head is that it is clearly a studio prop. Here is a painting, I believe correctly attributed to Verrocchio, that's in the Pitti Palace. You can see how very close it is to the head. It is also conceivable that Leonardo used this head or a head similar to it that he made himself. It's interesting to note that all of the terracotta sculptures, all the terracotta models we have by Verrocchio are studio props. They're not, in fact, finished works. They're preparatory works, but not of the very final stage of the design phase before carving or casting. Even these extremely finished models, if indeed they are for the Fortegueri monument, are of a size substantially smaller than the corresponding figures in the relief. And this piece in the Victoria and Albert Museum, has generally been identified as the model that he submitted for the competition, and I followed that hypothesis when I wrote my book. But I now think that it is in fact a preparatory model, not the final piece. And one of the reasons I think that is by comparison with a competition model by a slightly younger contemporary of Verrocchio, which is this, the birth of St. John the Baptist in the Victoria and Albert. And I think it was Gary Radke who first suggested that this was a relief made for the competition for the panel on the silver altar in 1477, and that seems incontrovertible to me. Now, Benedetto Damiano, unlike Verrocchio, what we have from him are almost all the very final model that was made at the end of the design phase. Here's an example. This fabulous angel in a private collection is the model for the corresponding figure in the altar in Naples. And here's another one. This is for the Santa Fina in Sant'Agostino in San Gimignano. We have an extraordinary case with Benedetto Damiano, which is the terracotta head in Berlin that is a preparatory model for the marble now in the Louvre. And if you saw them together in the great exhibition on Renaissance portraiture that was at Berlin and the Metropolitan a couple of years ago, I'm sure you were struck, as I was, by the great difference in character between the two works. The terracotta, you had this kind of empathetic experience with it, where what you were struck by was the sort of psychological or emotional character of the representation. Whereas the marble, he made it cooler and more remote, and instead it's a depiction or a personification of his moral excellence, his virtue, his public character. So in one, there was a greater emphasis on the sort of private person, and then in the final work, a greater emphasis on the public character as a citizen and merchant of Florence. Now, a pupil of Verrocchio, as you all know, Leonardo, made this extraordinary statement: "Sculpture is nothing other than a painstaking imitation of clay modeling and an operation of stone cutting with much effort and time. The more excellent and perfect it becomes, the closer it approaches clay modeling." And this suggests that as the making of sculpture progressed through the 15th and 16th century, increasingly it was the model that was the locus of creativity, whereas the final work was actually more of a execution of the a realization of what had been conceived and achieved in the model. Speaking of Leonardo, it is worth re-examining this extraordinarily beautiful terracotta model at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It has been called Leonardo by a wide variety of experts. So Kenneth Clark, in his outstanding monograph in 1939, called it Leonardo ? Ludwig von Heidenreich also said he thought it was Leonardo. But John Popenessy, in an article in 1949, and then again in his catalog of the museum in 1964, in a very peremptory manner said, that's impossible, it's by Antonio Rossellino. But there is now a new interest in examining the possibility of the attribution to Leonardo. Francesco Cagliotti published it as Leonardo in 2004, and Carmen Baumbach has told me that she will be publishing it in her book on Leonardo as a Leonardo. And it's easy to see what they have in mind. First of all, it looks a great deal like something that came from Verrocchio's shop. If you look at the knees and the drapery, you can see how it is related to the beautiful linen drapery studies that were made by Leonardo and others in Verrocchio's circle. The baby also looks very Verrocchio-esque in that if you look at the fat legs with the bands of fat on them and the feet with the toes curled up, this is something that you see in Verrocchio quite a lot in his paintings. But the sculpture does not seem to be by Verrocchio. Instead, it's the emphasis on the joyfulness of the child is something that is unmistakably reminiscent of the seated Virgin with a cat and the other designs he made for Madonna and Child paintings in the late 1470s. The idealization of the Madonna's head is also something that is inconceivable or of a different character than what we would imagine Verrocchio making, but instead in keeping with what we see Leonardo doing. And it's also worth noting how extraordinary the manner of finishing the surfaces. It has this kind of tremulous instantaneity of movement and detail in the depiction of its emotion, its happiness, which is almost unparalleled in the making of in the terracotta works that survive. So I think it's actually a extremely plausible idea that this is in fact by Leonardo. I'm going to finish today by speaking very briefly about Jacopo Sansovino's models. And I'm finishing there because Jacopo Sansovino is the first case where we have an artist whose models were collected extensively. So up to this point, models that survived seem to have either survived as studio property, or in the case of Benedetto da Maiano, where Benedetto thought of them as he saw that they could have a secondary purpose, so he would paint them and sell them on to be used in another commission separate from the one that they were originally made for. Sansovino, on the other hand, made models which were actually collected. And they were collected by connoisseurs, and they were collected by other artists as well. So in both of these extraordinary cases, Vasari tells us at some length about how beautiful the models were. Models don't survive, but how beautiful the models were and how cherished they were. We also have a case of a model by Sansovino, which was made for a painter, for Perugino. And it's extremely interesting that Sansovino was involved in making models for painters. We also have a painting of Vincenzo Borghini with his hand on, his left hand is on a model, which looks very much like the figure for the Hope in the Sarto Chiostro dello Scalzo, where we know, according to Vasari, a point that's been accepted by Friedberg and Sherman and others, that Sansovino made models for Sarto to use at that site. We also have this figure of Charity, which looks very much like it is the model for the corresponding figure in the Chiostro. And if you look at the Charity in relation to some works made in Rome, on the left is a print of a statue. It's one of the statues, conceivably, that Sansovino was asked to restore for Julius II. Or the Raphael on the right, you can see how the Charity is an attempt to summarize the discoveries that were, the aesthetic discoveries that were being made in Rome around 1510. And therefore, you can also imagine why Sansovino was so important to other painters to other artists when he returned to Florence. He was a conduit of their of the new developments occurring in Rome. And finally, I want to show this extraordinary work in a private collection that some of you know, which was made about 1520. And this shows why someone would, it's such a beautiful thing. It shows you why his models were collected. This is very likely a model made for a bust of Christ that was commissioned for one of the sisters of Charles V in Rome about 1520. It's mentioned in Francesco Sansovino's life of his father, and this is this is almost certainly it. And if you look at it in relation to the St. James in the cathedral, you can see how extremely close it is in its forms and details. So we could go on talking about the models and talk about the models of Michelangelo and John Bologna and others in the 16th century, culminating with Bernini as the sort of final stage in the history of the Florentine model, I believe. But I think we'll leave that for another talk some other day. Thank you.
The final speaker in today's first panel is Marietta Cambareri. Marietta holds a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, with a dissertation on the 16th century renovation projects at Orvieto Cathedral. She has worked at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston since 2001 and is currently Curator of Decorative Arts and Sculpture, Art of Europe, and Yetzkalina H. Phillips Curator of Judaica. She worked for 4 years in the sculpture department at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles and has been adjunct lecturer at New York University Washington Square College and at Boston College. Dr. Cambareri is co-author of a monograph on the Orvietan sculptor and architect Ippolito Scalza and of the catalog of Italian and Spanish sculpture at the Getty Museum. At the MFA, she curated the exhibition Donatello to John Bologna, Italian Renaissance Sculpture at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and is currently planning an exhibition on della Robbia sculptures in American collections, which will take place in 2016, an event that I, for one, am awaiting with bated breath. Her talk today is entitled Luca della Robbia's Istorie, the Duomo, Lunettes, and the Pistoia Visitation.
Thank you. I'd like to add my thanks to the chorus of thanks to Amy Block, Dan Zolli, and especially to Monsignor Timothy Verdon for inviting me to talk today about Luca della Robbia. I am currently working on an exhibition about the glazed terracotta sculpture invented and perfected by Luca and developed by his family's workshop and others. And I show you the MFA's Nativity with Gloria in Excelsis, attributed to Luca. It will be the first exhibition dedicated to glazed terracotta in America, and it will draw from American collections and seeks to bring to the fore the variety, significance, and appeal of this material for a broader American audience. Thanks in great part to the transformative scholarship of Giancarlo Gentilini in the last decades, this material is experiencing a little renaissance of its own. There have been major exhibitions in Italy and France. 3 PhD dissertations, at least known to me, there may be more, are underway on aspects of the della Robbia shop. Museums have been actively studying and conserving works that have long been neglected or hidden away in storage. And I show you the splendid roundel of Prudence at the Met, which I understand is slated for conservation, and the St. John the Baptist at the MFA, which was long hidden away in the attics and is now generally attributed to Giovanni Francesco Rustici. Private collectors are pursuing important examples as they come on the market, and I show you a relief attributed to Andrea and Giovanni that sold just a few weeks ago at Sotheby's. Prices are high. It was a little over $400,000. Yet, no general introduction to this material is available in English. The last major publication in English was John Pope Hennessy's masterful and heartfelt monograph on Luca, published in 1980. The story of American collecting has not been revisited since Alan Marquand's first book, and actually the first in the series of the Princeton monographs in the history of art, which was dedicated to della Robbias in America, published in 1912. He went on to publish 7 more volumes on the della Robbia, and Gentilini has pointed out that there's some irony to the fact that though Marquand wanted to open up possibilities for future study, his monumental survey of the material seems to have somewhat stifled further examination. In thinking about the show, I have naturally returned to the invention of glazed terracotta by Luca and its splendid debut of the material on a grand scale in the most prestigious of settings in 15th century Florence, the crossing of the cathedral, below Brunelleschi's recently completed cupola, the lunettes of the Resurrection and the Ascension. And you see them there. They are the focus of my talk today. It is striking that Luca's lunettes have not been studied with the intensity one might expect for such large-scale works in this most important of locations. Pope Hennessy's beautiful discussion of them may seem to leave little more to say, yet the pieces still do not find their way into the broader discourses of issues, for example, of narrative, of color and sculpture, the iconography and devotional and liturgical practice in the cathedral. For example, in 1997, a conference was held at Villa Itati on the sculpture of Florence Cathedral, followed by an impressive publication of the papers in 2001. Luca's glazed terracottas are mentioned only in passing, and this indicates simply that nobody was actively working on them at the time. This is changing as we gather today, and I'd like to acknowledge, for example, the work of Catherine Kubik, who's currently writing her dissertation on Luca at Rutgers, in which these reliefs will play an important role, and I particularly thank her because she's been serving as a research intern on the exhibition the last few months. In addition to Gentilini, Marco Coloreta and Marc Bourmont have discussed the invention and significance of glazed terracotta in persuasive terms, Bourmont in particular on the Resurrection, and the use and meanings of Luca's white glaze. And of course, vital work has been conducted by conservators, especially our late and much missed colleague, Maria Grazia Vaccari. So, In 1442, Luca della Robbia agreed to produce a relief representing the resurrection of Christ for the Opera del Duomo of Florence, to be set over the north door of the door of the north sacristy, best known as the Sacrestia delle Messe. It would be made in glazed terracotta, terra invetriata in the documents, and placed under the marble cantoria or pergamo and placed under the cantoria carved by Luca and set below the organ in the vast crossing of Florence Cathedral under the dome. And it's useful to look at Cigoli's drawing of the crossing because it gives you a sense of where the lunettes are in relation to the organs and a sense of the spacing that would have been as we would have looked at the lunettes originally. And just a little montage of the trio of works by Luca. The resurrection was completed in 1444, and as Pope Hennessy indicated, it's very likely that the plan was made at the same time for the relief of the Ascension, which would go over the door of the south sacristy and below Donatello's cantoria. The second relief was formally commissioned in 1446 and completed in 1451. So if we consider that Luca's task was to develop large-scale narrative reliefs on Christological themes for the crossing of the Cathedral of Florence, and to do so in a technique that was new to the greater Florentine public and recognized in its day as a new invention, we can only imagine the importance of the commission for the artist as well as for the opera. Overdoors were major zones for narrative and devotional messages at the cathedral, with the Marian scenes sculpted by Arnolfo di Cambio over the doors of the facade, the Great Assumption of the Virgin over the north door, known today as the Porta della Mandorla, but in the period as the Porta dei Servi or the Porta della Annunziata, because it looks down, oriented towards the Church of the Annunziata. It's an excellent example of how the imagery of the cathedral reached out into the city beyond. It is the most important sculptural precedent for Luca's reliefs. Doorways created layers of experience for those entering and exiting the sacred space, and so we should see the reliefs in relation to the interior and exterior facade portals, to the side doors. They relate to the liturgical function of the crossing, which holds the high altar, and of course, they open into the sacristies. These reliefs represent a significant introduction of Christological themes into the cathedral and into the cathedral crossing, and we should read them first and foremost as expressions of sacred history, faith, and liturgy. Well, how do they accomplish these functions? Very much through the characteristics of Luca's new medium and his skill in composition and narrative. Legibility, clarity, the symbolism of light and white, the great expanses of precious blue, the use of clay, the use of color, the use of the glazes, the alternative presentation of the body of Christ in each of the reliefs, and the alternative responses of the actors in each scene. All should be seen first in service of the sacred story and the representation of the body of Christ in the cathedral interior. This is the period following the completion of the cupola, marked by a flurry of activity as the space was opened to the congregation, the high altar transferred into the crossing, and the cathedral consecrated by the Pope. The proper housing of the Eucharist was being considered, and Luca's work on the second lunette would be interrupted by another more pressing commission for the cathedral, also in glazed terracotta. The candle-bearing angels, which would flank a new sacramental tabernacle. And in these very same years, Antoninus would visit the cathedral and effect changes in the reservation of the Eucharist. Considered in relation to the high altar, the resurrected Christ is a powerful sculptural representation of the real presence of Christ, a theme that Timothy Verdon has stressed for the cathedral interior. We might see Luca's resurrected Christ as the forerunner of figures of the risen Christ that would appear on sacramental tabernacles, this being an early example of Vecchiettas of about 1470. Luca's figure of Christ is modeled in clay, generally recognized in the period for its antiquity, and as Andrew pointed out, its Etrurian antiquity, and its humility as a material for sculpture, but clay transformed by the brilliant white glaze. The white figures stand out in brilliant relief against the blue, and this, of course, is Luca's principal goal, the accomplishment of relief or projection or salience, an ideal vehicle to express the idea of the real presence. Luca had already experimented with the setting of white marble against pure even blue, also in the representation of the body of Christ, in the sacramental tabernacle for the hospital church of Sant'Egidio, now in Santa Maria in Peretola, of 1441-3. This presentation of the body of Christ and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist surely informed the next step in the Lunettes. The sense of relief and the visual detachment of the figures from the blue field seems the visual and conceptual step that would lead to Luca's earliest glazed terracottas in the round, the angels for the Duomo, and then to Luca's masterpiece in sculpture presented to Totondo in the round, the Visitation in Pistoia. In each of these works, Luca's materials and techniques are in perfect accord with the theological messages of the subjects. The even white color and the glaze allow the modeling to stand forth. The white figures in the reliefs assert their sense of three-dimensionality set against the pure, opaque, even blue of the sky. And in this winter, I can't help but show a Matisse cutout, which reminds us of the visual power of blue and white. Marc Bourmont has recently discussed the qualities and characters of Luca's white glaze, suggesting that the glaze softens the sharp edges of his model and creates a kind of non finito that corresponds to Donatello's more atmospheric carving, and allowing for greater legibility. One of the most pervasive misconceptions about glazed terracotta is that it was invented as a cheap, quick alternative to marble. Bourmont states with beautiful clarity an alternative rationale for the development of the material, that it would accomplish this goal of visibility better than marble ever could. Luca's cantoria, set high up in the crossing, in a darkish space, must not have been very visible. Now, white marble against blue backgrounds has a long history in Florence, back to the Trecento, of course, and I show the beautiful Andrea Pisano Madonna and Child for the Porta del Campanile. What Luca does is find a way to accomplish this pure white associated with marble and make the white even whiter, even more pure, and even more visible. And I would further suggest that Luca's opaque white and even glaze serves to capture and preserve his model, and then seeks to control as many variables as possible, variables of color and reflection that might alter over time and in different lighting conditions. Greater visibility also guarantees that the stories represented are communicated more effectively. Luca conveys important messages in the way these lunettes interact with the viewer or worshiper. Classical sources have been identified for the soldiers, especially the figure in the foreground, one of the most exquisite figures in 15th century sculpture, which draws on the Endymion figure from Roman sarcophagi, this in Pisa, possibly known to Luca. The viewer and worshiper can only be beguiled into this dream, but it is a dream from which one must awake in faith. The soldiers sleep through this central moment in Christian belief, which is not recorded in the Gospels and was not witnessed by Christ's followers. Their alternative is represented by the group of faithful witnesses to the Ascension. Here, the space opens up to invite the worshiper to take part, and the figures are carefully presented in perspective. And I would love to see a perspective grid drawn for these reliefs. I don't think that's been done. They are unified by their positions, but varied in their physiognomies. Leon Battista Alberti would surely appreciate them as exemplars of actors in a sacred history. As Pope Hennessy stressed, The Resurrection is the first major Renaissance example of this Christian narrative, which likely inspired artists including Piero della Francesca. And yet these lunettes are rarely considered in the context of Albertian Istoria. The Cantoria reliefs are often discussed in Albertian terms, the narrative reliefs almost never. These reliefs fulfill many of Alberti's ideals as put forth in his treatise on painting, but they are not typically mentioned as early reflections of the treatise, even though they are by one of the artists that Alberti recognizes in his dedication of the Italian version of 1436, along with Brunelleschi, to whom it's dedicated, Donatello, Ghiberti, and Masaccio. We are reminded, of course, that painting and sculpture, and especially relief sculpture, were not seen as separate arts, but flowing from the same source of disegno. Both painters and sculptors had this desire, of course, to create relief, salience. It's a central goal. The modern example of an Istoria for Alberti was the so-called Navicella by Giotto, a mosaic, so a painting in a more permanent material, and a material that is often associated with the brilliance and permanence of Luca's glazed terracottas. Now lost, I show you a drawing that records the composition by Pari Spinelli at the Met. The group of apostles display the variety of reactions that we have already noted for the Ascension. In both reliefs, the discipline of approach could be seen as evocative of Giotto and his followers. In both lunettes, the number of figures hold to the Albertian recommendation of 9 to 10 figures, 10 in the Resurrection and 13 in the Ascension, as called for by the story. The balance and decorum that Luca achieves in these reliefs is fundamental to Alberti's ideas. Qualities of variety, narrative invention, careful composition of space, all makes clear why Luca was one of the artists named by Alberti in 1436. For Alberti, Luca was among the artists bringing fame and glory to Florence through their ingegno. Among Alberti's artists, perhaps we feel that Luca hadn't yet proved himself. But here, with the Resurrection, we really witness an artist coming into his own in an atmosphere where we know invention and competition and accomplishment are so important. We know that everybody would have been commenting on this relief. Can't we imagine somebody saying, Luca, this is great. This is what you should be concentrating your efforts on going forward. And he may have said that to himself, but we might imagine that others like Brunelleschi and Alberti might have said the same thing. Here we might remember that even in humanist discourse, the most important goal for the artist was to excel at his own craft, find what he was best at, and Luca was surely doing this here. To conclude, I review some Renaissance perceptions of this technique that is sometimes still today seen as decorative and less serious than marble and bronze. The Opera del Duomo already praised and rewarded Luca for his ingenuity in his new medium. Manetti says very clearly that Luca was a master sculptor of bronze and marble and clay, and was the first to have discovered how to glaze figures. Manetti stresses that in the cathedral we can see three wonderful works by him: the bronze doors of the north sacristy, the pergamo above, and the lunettes above the doors of both sacristies, which he describes as figures of glass, figure di vetro, ovvero terra invetriata, figures of glass, or rather of glazed clay. Leonardo recognized and praised Luca's achievement in creating a technique that would make clay and color permanent, something that Vasari would stress as well later on. Pomponius Gauricus praised Luca for this invention, which he compares to ancient encaustic painting. And Vasari secured Luca's fame for posterity as the inventor of a new and useful technique, one that was unknown to the ancients, and that produced sculpture that was quasi eterna, one that could last almost forever. Yet, it has become commonplace to diminish even Luca's invention by saying that he didn't invent the technique, but merely perfected contemporary ceramic techniques. And this seems to be, at this point, to be a notion born in the early 19th century. Here I show you an example of the very beautiful blue and white achieved by Florentine Maiolica, the Zaffiro ware, in the first half of the 15th century. It's a very different thing. Finally, everything we are learning about della Robbia technique confirms that Luca's ingenio and his invention is to be taken very seriously and not to be diminished. There is careful attention to the composition of the clay, which can almost be compared to the master goldsmith perfecting his alloys. It's developed particular to support the perfect marriage between clay and glaze. And of course, the closely guarded secret for the opaque, pure colors. I'd like to close with a description of the interior of Florence Cathedral as a modern agora, which puts the reliefs into another context. The Duomo interior as the ideal and elevating place where friends might meet and walk and talk. Quote, "Indeed, it embodies both grace and majesty. I have often thought that it is fine to see combined within it a blithe gracefulness and a robust solidity. On the one hand, each part of it seems directed towards delightful beauty. On the other, we apprehend it as made for all eternity. Here, one might say, there is always the mild air of spring. Outside, there might be wind, ice, frost. Here, inside, sheltered from the winds, the air is warm and calm. Outside, there may be blazing heats of summer. Here, inside, it is temperate and cool." These are not the words of a heroine in a novel by Henry James or E.M. Forster. They were written by Luca's friend and supporter, Leon Battista Alberti, in the early 1440s in his treatise on the tranquility of the mind, or refuge from tribulation. Luca's reliefs, too, have these qualities of grace and majesty, immediate beauty, but made for eternity. The blue glaze does recall, most of all, the azure skies of a Tuscan spring, and it's a perfect place to imagine ourselves on this cold February day. Thank you.
Pace Alberti, I have never once, even in spring, felt that the interior of Florence Cathedral is spring-like. So now, in the first place, I'd like to thank our speakers for a rich, exhilarating group of papers in this first panel, and invite them up here to, I think we'll take a few questions from the audience. We have a microphone circulating.
I have a question for Marietta. I was wondering, Marietta, could you review what we know about the records of payment for, I mean, just in terms of demonstrating or not that we can't, how much was paid for Luca's reliefs?
Oh gosh, I can't tell you that off the bat. I'm sorry. Okay. I do know that it went through the usual process of they offer him a certain amount, and after they're completed, they review it, and he is given sort of a bonus for literally for his invention.
Right, right.
So I'm sorry, but I can't give you the exact kind of numbers.
Marietta, at least in photographs, the blues are quite noticeably different.
I don't think they're as different as they are in the photographs. It's just hard to find. It's very hard to find a pair. They pretty much are. Thank you. But thanks for pointing that out, because it was a little challenging to find the best photos.
I have a question for Andrew. First of all, thank you. How invigorating. Hell of a lot to chew on in that lecture, Andrew. Thank you very much. Very exciting. Very exciting. I just want to ask you a quick question. I thought your point about the suppleness of Donatello's vision that might have been transferred to the stone from manipulating the terracotta was an extremely interesting one and acceptable, believable. But I also wanted to raise the issue of how much he might have worked with actual fabric, because we know he worked with fabric, as Dick Stone has shown, on the Judith. And have you thought that perhaps some of his drapery, maybe he was already doing these drapery cloth dipped in gesso to, I'm not saying he was Leonardo, but maybe he was already working with cloth as a sort of addendum to what you've already, I'm not denying anything you've said, I'm just saying maybe that's an addendum to be considered alongside what you've already done.
I completely agree with you that that is a very likely scenario. And as you said, Dick Stone pointed out that in the Judith, he actually used real cloth, and it would be completely, I think that's a very plausible hypothesis and definitely worth further investigation. So that he was a draper, right?
Like some other people we know.
His father was. His father was a diattore, so there's probably cloth in the house all the time.
Dr. Butterfield, question please. Given that all these works were commissioned by patrons, and that at various stages in the contract, the patron would be checking with the artist with preparatory drawings and so forth, is there any indication that the use of models might also relate to a changed expectation on the part of the patron for the creation of the work of art?
I don't know. I just don't know the answer to your question. I should have said that I don't believe we have a single record of a contractual record or documentary record of a three-dimensional model before 1412. But other than the model for the Andrea Pisano door, I don't, so, but I don't know the answer to your question.
Me. I just wanted to return to Dr. McKem's question and say, Luca, sure. Luca was paid 500 lira for the first lunette and 550 for the second, and the first lunette translates to about 110 florins. And what's really important and what underscores Marietta's argument is that the price for the first lunette was not fixed ahead of time. It was decided once he had finished. And like Marietta had mentioned, that price was divided into two parts. One of them being for his industria e invenzione, I believe that's the phrase, so his industry, his work and his invention, and then the other being for the sculpture more generally. So the payment itself is reporting that this is a new material, a new invention, and that that is worth some sort of monetary compensation.
And yet, in terms of perhaps what Sarah was getting at, the variety of ways in which Luca is compensated for these things would, in fact, make the terracotta a lot less well compensated than the Canteria, which is hundreds and hundreds of florins. And I don't have the bronze door figures in front of me, but I'm sure that the bronze doors had to have been extremely expensive. That doesn't, however, it doesn't deny what you've said, that it's not done just because it's cheaper or whatever. It is a special material unto itself, but we shouldn't be misled by the fact that because the materials are a bit more humble, that it may be able to be produced more cheaply.
Exactly, and Florentines love a bargain, as we know.
Exactly.
And we did need this to happen fast because things were happening fast. So those should be seen as positives and not negatives.
If I may ask you to consider a possibility, but I think we've even discussed it together in Florence, the glossy finish of the terracotta there in the timpana in the cathedral would of course be seen in proximity to the lighting arrangement on Brunelleschi's choir, which was about the same height.
Right.
And since we normally assume that Brunelleschi, together with Ghiberti, still had a voice in the choices made in the ongoing decoration of the sanctuary area, I wonder if you'd like to think about an interest in light, in the glitter that the surface could give within the larger context of that whole decorative scheme that seemed to really focus in many ways on lighting effects.
Absolutely, and also you have to take into account the wonderful stained glass windows that are being produced at the same time, and there is a real consideration of how lighting effects are going to work in that space. I completely do agree with you.
Marietta? Just to add to that, because what I found so striking was your beautiful tying together of Alberti's description of Giotto's navicella, mosaic, which is painting in glass. And then when Manetti calls these tympana, his work, glass.
Exactly.
Figures in glass. And just because you brought together the exterior of the cathedral, sort of in concert with the interior of the crossing. But just as you walk out, into the church, then the church opens up in this beautiful permanent painting, the stained glass windows which were being envisioned. And I can't think of any more beautiful transition between the bronzes and then the glass above than that. So it really was given so much for thinking about the program overall as a whole. So thank you.
And I have to say, Marco Coloreta, Giancarlo Gentilini have all associated the notion of glazed terracotta with mosaic, with glass. It's absolutely a concert of visual effort, I think.
Thank you, Andrew. That one 14th century terracotta you referred to at the cloisters, it does function as a model for a goldsmith. There's actually physical evidence in the back of it that has a positioning slot for a flange in metal, silver or some repoussé technique to be molded around that piece. So it actually did function that way. It had an afterlife being transformed into a polychrome piece for sale, as you probably indicated, but that has a life of its own at beginning as a goldsmith model. But I had a question for Robert, though, and that was the classical exemplum you referred to between Rome and Florence in around 1400 for the entry doorways there. Is it necessary to look back to medieval drolleries, more specifically because you keep referring to, and I think correctly, to St. Peter's in Rome and the twisted columns there, the Cathedra Petri, the great Carolingian throne of Charles the Bald, has on it extraordinarily close compositions of inhabitants, scrolls of putti and archers and Hercules, of course, that in its afterlife became associated with the Cathedra Petri, of course. So I think there was a conscious effort around 1400 because it was exposed at that point in time that it could have been a specific reference to something that was associated with St. Peter's itself.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a really big topic. These are really complicated reliefs with a lot of figures, and I mean, I'm coming at this from Filarete's doors, but I looked when I was first trying to come to terms with this. I looked a lot at the Cathedra Petri as well, because yes, this is a wooden throne that's inlaid with ivory that probably dates from the 9th century, but was thought to be St. Peter's chair as bishop. So it has very small ivory friezes that are also peopled scrolls. So, and there is pagan iconography in those as well. So you're absolutely right to point that out. But I don't know if I've found exact kind of correspondences, but in a larger study, that would be definitely something that would be mentioned. And there are others, like you mentioned, the Solomonic columns. They also have putti and animals in their vines. So it's a big topic of which I kind of only just started to touch on.
So I wanted to suggest, it's been a long time since I've looked at this, so I may be dead wrong, but I think that the exterior of the Cathedral of Pisa has peopled scrolls too.
Yeah,
and that would have been of interest to Florence.
That's a really important precedent. I mentioned just briefly in passing that there's several. It was one line where I just said there's several late medieval examples that I'm going to skip over because they also point back to the Oratory of John VII. But what Sarah's referring to is on the front. You're thinking about Pisa, but I think there's actually there are some examples there, but there's a more important example on the front of Siena Cathedral. There are two.
I said Pisa, I meant Siena.
Okay. because Pisa does have, the baptistry also has some columns with vines, but there are only 2 figures on those columns. But in Siena, there are 2 very large columns on the front of the cathedral, and Max Seidel has written a really long, this is back in the 60s, a really long article about these, exploring their iconography, which is, it's basically just full of putti. And he then does incorporate some Christian iconography there, scenes of David, because there's a statue of David above. So it's not quite as the same thing, but at the end of his article, he suggests perhaps there is an emulation of the Chapel of John the Seventh there too, and he links it specifically to these reliefs. So that's a precedent, and obviously Siena is a rival of Florence. But I think if that's part of their motivation for kind of adopting this motif, they're still going back to the ancient reliefs when they actually think about what they're going to do. But thanks for bringing that up, because it's, again, a really nice example that I just didn't have time to mention.
Caroline?
This is for Robert. I'm wondering if you've considered how the peopled scroll as a framing device fits into the context of the typological relationship you're drawing. So for example, it's hard not to notice that the 2 pieces that we have upstairs, the one with the Man of Sorrows is so crisply framed in an architectural border, whereas the Hercules is in a leaf and a canthus border. So I'm wondering if there's a dialogue there between being contained within a border, falling outside the border, and the use of the scroll as a frame itself. Not just as a frame for figures, but then again, as a frame for the door, it becomes a sort of essay on framing.
Well, I don't know if I've thought about all those things, but I think there's a very clear logic as to why the image of the Man of Sorrows is framed. There's a distinction drawn in those reliefs on the Porta della Mandorla between the Christian world and the pagan one. So all the Christian figures are set off by frames, whereas, so these include the angels with scrolls, whereas all the pagan ones are in the acanthus leaves. And on the Porta dei Canonici, there's a different kind of way that dialogue between pagan past and Christian future is represented. There's a very few figures of bearded men who are clothed with scrolls within the pagan borders on the Porta dei Canonici, and these must be prophets. So they're living in that time, but they're telling of the Christian time. So I think different artists are kind of playing with this in different ways, and Filarete does it in an entirely different way that's quite complex with how he uses the vines, because the image of Christ on St. Peter's doors, which is in one of the main panels, has vines growing out of him. So he spawns in kind of a different vine, and they encompass his throne. And so this dialogue is something that the artists are thinking about, and it's another example of how they respond differently to the challenge that poses. So I think that answers part of your question.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Yes, I just want to add in one more thought about the importance and richness of your focusing on how frames work and the relationship to antiquity, because from my point of view, in studies that came from very different approaches, one of the places I think it ends up is with the Ignudi in the Sistine Chapel as part of a framing device. And there you have that license for nude figures in Christian situations, licensed by antiquity, and with that distinction that they are, after all, decorative framing of the narrative stories. So your work is very systematically, I think, establishing that kind of jump.
That's a really nice example that I hadn't thought of. I'll just say quickly that one place where I do see more in that period this kind of interest in the marginal and filling the marginal up with iconography that kind of defies a coherent program is in the Loggia of Leo X by Raphael and his shop, which is just another one of these programs that no one's been able to make sense of, because these are margins that are full of kind of an infinite variety of things. So, thank you.
Yeah, just when you talk about typology and the margins, and even on the Sistine ceiling, I mean, I think they do all relate, but they all are of a piece. If it's typological, the pagan world can't stand on the margins. It is at the threshold of the coming of Christ. It's the age before the law. And that's why, they can appear, pagan imagery can appear on a doorway, just as Michelangelo's nudes can appear on the Sistine ceiling. It is for the same reason. So you do have that tremendous creativity, but it is also, part of the typological scheme as we've laid out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's justification for it. Yes. Absolutely. But the fact that it occurs in the margins allows perhaps artists to be kind of more unconventional in representing that kind of idea of the pagan world than they would be if it was in a kind of a more central place.
Well, you can see we've whet our intellectual appetites, but we do have to break for lunch.